From London, I'm John Weeks, and this is The Standard. London, one of, if not the greatest city in the world, full of culture, opportunity and possibility. But are Londoners themselves getting ruder? Think about it. How many more times now do people barge on before letting passengers on the tube? Those instances where you have to listen to that one person on a bus blasting their terrible music on their phone on loudspeaker seem to be getting much more frequent. And the infuriating sound of tutting might as well echo through the capital during rush hour these days. Well, you're not imagining it. Rudeness is on the rise, and the public is taking note.
Is London getting ruder? I'd say definitely more so. So I have a bias. I used to live for Japan a little bit, like for COVID years. So obviously in there, it's quite nice, quite mannered. When I came out to London, things are quite ruder. People are quite unsociable, and people just feel like more annoyed to speak with you.
So, I've been living here for a few months now, and people have been surprisingly nice to me, especially colleagues at work. Although on the commute, people are pretty rough at times.
Joining me now is Maddy Mussen, features journalist at The Evening Standard. So, Maddy, is London getting ruder?
Yes, definitely. It's something that I noticed kind of circumstantially as I was just moving about the place. And then it was something that I noticed when I talked to people, it was just coming up more and more, and people were really identifying with it when I would bring it up. And then I was like, oh, I've got to write about this. It's clearly getting worse. And I really had this feeling that it had been something that had occurred since the pandemic. And so I was like, oh, okay, I'll look into this. And what I found was very much proof that it was getting ruder. There was proof that it was getting ruder, kind of cities in general are getting ruder. And actually the world, I think, is getting ruder. There's evidence that it's like everybody's kind of everyday interactions with rudeness have risen substantially. But London in itself is also getting ruder. And there's a lot of stats from TfL, a lot of anecdotal experiences from people working in the service industry, and also statistics to back that up as well, that show that everybody is facing a significant amount more rudeness recently.
That's it. And it's a really unique thing to try to measure and quantify. What are some of the figures that you have managed to gather which do suggest that it's getting ruder?
So the first one that I noticed was the TfL services like buses, tubes, etc., that we all get on every single day. That seemed to be the hub of the rudeness. I think probably just because Londoners are forced to be in such close confines with each other, and obviously there's so many people, you interact with so many people just on your way to work. That's where I first noticed it. And the figures that support that are that antisocial behaviour and public transport-based crime are up by 30%. But London-wide crime is only up by 8%. So clearly, when people are being forced in these close confines with each other, they are it's substantially worse than, let's say, the whole city. And that's primarily made up of antisocial behaviour. So people are being ruder, and it is escalating on public transport. And then it's also not just TfL, Network Rail, which also encompasses Southwestern Rail, so that includes London. They say that 9 out of 10 of their rail workers have suffered abuse recently. I think it's in the past couple of years, from verbal abuse to full-on physical assaults. So transport is a really key area where you can witness this rise. And then in the restaurant sector, anecdotally, I've spoken to a lot of restaurant owners and front of house staff who say that people are just completely doing away with usual traditions like cancelling bookings or turning up on time for bookings. And then obviously anecdotally it gets much worse with people being outright horrible and abusive to restaurant staff and changing their children's diapers on the table and stuff like that, and not informing them of allergies until the food is placed right in front of their face. And then in the theatre industry, I think people have probably heard about this because this is quite a prominent story last year, but there's been such a big issue with rudeness in theatres and lewd behaviour. And there was a 2023 survey that revealed that 90% of theatre staff reported having directly experienced or witnessed poor audience behaviour, and 50% were considering quitting over it.
That's it. And some of the examples you mentioned there, the nappy on the table is probably the most shocking example I can think of rudeness. Was that the worst one for you? Were there any others that sort of shocked you the most?
the thing that bothered me is more how often I was hearing about it. It's like when I brought it up to people, everyone was regaling me with the recent story of how they had tried to get off the tube and people don't move out of the way anymore. Like they don't let people off before boarding. And that is, I think, one of the like key pillars of London's etiquette. That is something like that, alongside with standing to the right when we're on escalators. You know, you just do it by nature. And it's really weird to me that people would almost unlearn this etiquette in favor of, I guess, like what, looking after themselves first. Like it's just a really messed up thing. And the fact that every time I brought it up to someone, they had been like, yeah, this happened to me. Like no one's waiting to get off the tube anymore. Like no one is waiting to let people off. And you see it, if you get off the tube in the next week, watch as your tube carriage doors open and see how many people are just stood in front of them and how many people you have to barge past. Like it's just really, really rude.
Let's go to the ads now, coming up in part 2.
I think that the thing that we haven't developed is this language around asking people not to be rude. And I think that we need to develop that language, and then also people need to start being receptive to it.
Welcome back. Still with me is our features journalist, Maddy Mussen. A lot of the stuff mentioned does appear to be sort of minor inconveniences, but you kind of stressed in your piece the circumstances where this kind of rudeness actually has a bigger impact, like with the theatre example, people talking about, thinking about quitting their jobs.
Yeah, and also it can go even further than that. I spoke to this rudeness expert, he's called Amir Erez, and he was really interesting, and he told me that on a kind of smaller level, it can cause people to really not enjoy their jobs. It can cause customer service assistants to make mistakes. It can cause, but then also, this is the thing, it can cause nurses and doctors to make mistakes. People who have faced instances of rudeness, it kind of messes with it's like a butterfly effect type situation. It messes with their brain for the rest of that day or for the immediate moments afterwards. And it can cause even medical professionals to make mistakes. And there's studies that prove that, it could literally put people's lives at risk, which is really scary.
And it was only until I'd read your article that I found out that there are actually academic experts in rudeness. I understand one or two of them have, as you predicted, associated this rise in rudeness, linked it with COVID.
No, there's a bunch of academics that study rudeness, actually. I found it really interesting finding them, especially because they tend to be quite curt over email, which is interesting. Don't know how that works as a politeness and rudeness researcher, but I spoke to them and they were all pretty certain that it was related or at least worsened by COVID. There's something called civil inattention. And I was told this by Jim O'Driscoll, who's the editor of the Journal of Politeness Research, if you can believe there is such a thing. And he told me that this civil inattention thing is basically what we all do every day in London, where we go around kind of pretending that the people next to us don't exist. It's what we need to do to get by. Because if you just moved around the world saying like hi to everyone you saw as if you were in a really, really small village or they were all people you knew, you would be tired and you'd lose your voice, and it's just not possible. So we do that and that's fine. But apparently, according to him, in the pandemic, we ramped this up so much that now, post-pandemic, it's not necessarily that we're kind of civil inattentive. We are almost just to the point where it's uncivil, inattentive. And it's less like we're not paying attention to people for our own good, but more that we actively are pretending that we are the only people in the world and we can do what we want. It's like we're in our own bubble and we've given up on caring what the people next to us care about or if they feel comfortable. For instance, that's a real one that I feel when I hear people listening to videos out loud on the bus or like taking really loud FaceTime calls on the bus, and there are people that sat right next to them and I'm like, why are you not thinking about them? That you're right in their ear. That all these people on this bus that you could be thinking about. But it's moved from civil inattention to uncivil inattention, clearly.
And do you think sort of smartphones are a big part of that as well? Because they seem to crop up in a lot of these examples.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was. One of the experts I spoke to made a very good point where they were like, well, now you can get 4G on a lot of the underground tube lines, so we're not safe anywhere anymore. Like, we're rapidly losing spaces where we're protected from the internet. and we're losing those spaces. And that also means that I think there's also a level where people's usage of their phones and the internet in lockdown was so protected in their own homes. Obviously, they could listen to things out loud on their phones whenever they wanted to because they were on their own or they were just with their family. You know, it wasn't a big deal. And it's almost like they've translated that weird kind of isolated cell phone behavior to the outside world without realizing that actually like there are other people around that don't want to hear that. And yeah, I think it's maybe like comes with the selfishness of being on the internet. It's been compared to that TikTok phrase, main character energy. And it's just like you don't want to think about anyone else. You think you are the main character and therefore everything you do is fine.
So what's the fix, Maddy? What do you think needs to happen to have this sort of cultural shift away from this kind of behaviour? Or do you think that naturally it will just shift back to what it was like before?
I actually don't know if it will shift back, and that's what scares me. It's been rising at such a rate, and I've noticed it just getting worse and worse. And I've also not really noticed many people tackling it, let's say, in the real world. I see people getting annoyed and bothered by people, but I don't see anyone managing it in a kind of measured way. It's often with rudeness, it kind of, if you're bothered by it, if you're bothered by something, say like on the bus or on the tube, you put up with it, especially British people who are so polite and to the point where we go a bit mad. You put up with it to the point where you start to feel insane. It's bothering you so much. And I think that the thing that we haven't developed is this language around asking people not to be rude. And I think that we need to develop that language, and then also people need to start being receptive to it. Because if people know how to politely ask someone, oh, I'm sorry, could you turn your phone down? Or, oh, is it okay if you put your headphones in or something like that? Once that becomes possible, I think that we will be moving forwards. I also think that TfL have previously run these campaigns. I can't remember what they were called. It was something like travel kind campaigns. And it was all about how you should behave on public transport around other people. They're running other campaigns at the moment that are really good, but they used to run these campaigns. And I think that they could do with running some more, let's say. Like, I think just basic signage might be good because it just means that people feel validated in asking people to stop doing certain behaviors. Or it means that people will just maybe like clock it when they're doing it and they'll be like, oh, maybe I should just turn my phone down a bit. Or like, maybe I should just move down the carriage or let people off first. I think that is necessary at the moment.
You can read more about this story and others in the Evening Standard newspaper or head to standard.co.uk. Thanks for listening. We're back tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock.